Well, I'm very happy to be here with you today. I know your chapels are sometimes pretty awesome. I'm sorry I'm not a rock star. I do like karaoke, but maybe we won't do that today. So I'm a professor, I'm a sociologist, and I study China. Right now I'm doing a project where I am looking at how Chinese people define happiness. But in it, I'm looking at how people see what a good death is, and through that I want to see how people see what a good life is. But one of the things I want to talk about today, actually, is the view of death and life that I read when I read Psalm 90. So I experienced the death of my mother 3 years ago. And you guys are young-ish. How many of you guys are between 18 and 22? Yes, okay. So probably most of you have not experienced the death of a really close person, like a parent or a close friend, but maybe some of you already have. So I was very refreshed by Psalm 90 because, actually in part because it shows how deficient some of the ideas that we use in American society to understand death are. So my message to you is that if and when it happens, likely a when, that you do experience the death of a loved one, don't feel bad if you don't feel like you have the right resources to kind of sense what is going on. So let me explain. So let me tell you about my mother and what happened when she passed away. So she was diagnosed with colon cancer right when I was starting grad school. And at that time, the doctor said that given the test results and things like that, she probably had about 2 years-ish to live. So she did chemotherapy and all the things associated with it, and actually managed to make it to almost 10 years. I did a lot of grieving, probably at the beginning of when when we found out, because it was the shock of realizing that she would die at some point. But then at the end of her life, it was still really hard. That last month of her life, I was actually able to be at home, but it was really, really hard. She, didn't look very good, and she just looked worse every day. And it was hard because it was hard to emotionally feel that God was a nice and compassionate and kind person, or God, while looking at her looking that way. So it was a hard time, and probably you guys are wondering, was she saved, right? Because this is important. She is, or was. She is believed and professed faith in Jesus, but it was still very hard. My experience of her death actually presented me with 3 conceptual constructs that are used in, or typical in our American society. And it was reflected in the way that people sort of responded to it. So the 3 things that I was faced with, I guess, were 1, denial of death, 2, the goal of letting go, and 3, what I'm going to call an aggressive stance. But reading Psalm 90, actually, was very interesting more recently because it presents a really different view of death than these 3 things that are typical in American society. Okay, so I'm going to read a little bit of Psalm 90. So the first verse begins, "Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. Before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. You turn men back to dust, saying, 'Return to dust, O sons of men. For 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by, or like a watch in the night. You sweep men away in the sleep of death. They are like the new grass of the morning. Though in the morning it springs up new, by evening it is dry and withered. Okay, so this is just the beginning of the psalm. Denial of death. Do the first few verses deny death? No. The phrase "the denial of death" is from a really famous book by Ernest Becker that was published in the 1970s. And in it, he talks about how we have this tendency to deny death. Our bodies are fragile, we're kind of afraid, we have no control over nature, and it's scary. So we deny it, and also to counter the fear, we look to heroic efforts to make our lives significant and to make our lives matter. To count, to achieve something, so that we won't be forgotten and so that we won't make a difference. But this is really interesting. I mean, the psalm doesn't deny it at all. They, it's out there. I did experience the way people responded to news about my mother's death, this denial of it. So I got a really well-meaning, for example, email from a pastor who said, I heard the sad news about your mom, and then some nice things about, let me know if you need anything. But what was interesting is that he was afraid to say, I heard the sad news that your mom died, because he didn't want to say the word death. And people kind of skirted around the issue sometimes. They didn't know what to do. The weird thing about death is that it's kind of, it's kind of a part of life, right? But we treat it as if it's an anomaly, like some sort of weird thing that happens, like an error or something. And then when it happens, people just kind of let's just kind of move on if we can. Well, my research in China, people actually, in everyday or in the rhythms of life, they incorporate death much more into life than we do here in American society. So for them, New Year's is like Christmas and Thanksgiving combined. Everyone goes home to visit their parents and their grandparents, no matter how far they live from them, everyone goes home. And it's a fun time, everybody gets together, visits people. But one of the things that they do, actually, is everybody goes and visits the graves of their parents or grandparents. And interestingly, it is actually kind of a good memory. It's a good time for the family to get together and catch up and stuff like that. But they incorporate visiting the grave. It's not a creepy thing. The other thing is that there's at least one more time of the year that it's sort of a thing. There's an official holiday called the grave sweeping or tomb sweeping holiday, and people get 2 days off to go and visit the grave and clean it up. And that's also a happy time. It's a traditional thing. So it's not creepy to visit graves. It's actually a happy time. Weird, right? Okay, the thing about the denial of death is that in Psalm 90, verse 12, so I'm going to skip ahead, he says, "Teach us to number our days aright, that we may gain a heart of wisdom." Oh, so, okay, how do we get wisdom again? We're supposed to number our days? Is that? I haven't actually numbered my days, although I am getting there where I'm going to have to start numbering them. But, this is not something we tend to do as I'm going to be wise by numbering our days. But this is not the denial of death, right? This is a psalmist, the psalmist is really, really acknowledging it here. Okay, 2, the second thing, the second conceptual construct that I was faced with that was the goal of letting go. So there's a really famous book by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross on death and dying, which is still read today, also published in the 1970s. And in it, she talks about the experience of death and, from the point of view of the dying. And then it's really, really good, especially from sort of a medical or a patient standpoint. But one of the things she says is that at the end, the dying detach themselves slowly from all the meaningful relationships in life. And then the living have to kind of do the same. And I think on a health point of view, that makes sense, because biologically, it's necessary and stuff. But what's interesting is that this detachment or this letting go isn't necessarily in the psalm either. So in the verses 1 and 2, it's, Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. So all generations, that includes dead people and living people, and it's sort of this living or dying, we're in it together with God. It's a vision that's together like this, and it's not sort of this alone, being alone and detaching from people. Actually, people are still together even through life and through death. And actually, I love the epicness of this psalm. Like, you've been our dwelling place throughout the generations. It's a lot of people. We're all together. And then before the mountains you were born, you brought forth the earth and the world. And then this, everlasting is already like pretty big, but it's from everlasting to everlasting. It's just a huge, sweeping vision of what life and death is about. So when this detachment or this thing where we think we're supposed to let go, after my mother passed away, I got this email from the Georgetown bereavement group. It wasn't just to me, it was just like, a general announcement for the bereavement group, and they're gonna meet. And it was like, oh, bring your lunch, and then we can, we'll all help each other and talk. We'll help each other move on and let go. And I remember reading it and thinking, move on, let go. I mean, something about that doesn't feel right. So my mother passed away, and I'm supposed to move on? Am I ever not going to be her daughter? Is she ever not going to be my mother? No, this relationship continues. I mean, for me, I will always be her daughter. So I didn't like that. It didn't gel with me. And part of it, in my research in China, people don't feel like their relationship's just like, if somebody dies, that relationship is over. Actually, people see it as the relationships continue. You're not supposed to let go. If somebody is still sad, about their parents, or they're remembering them or something, people go, oh, that's great. You're a really good, son, or you're a really good daughter. The grief is not supposed to be like, oh, like you should move on. Okay, and then the third conceptual construct is this thing I'm going to call an aggressive stance toward life. So reading Psalm 90, it is not an aggressive stance toward life, which is kind of countercultural for us, I think. We're supposed to make the best of our time. Time is money. We want to win. We want to be productive. We want to succeed. We want to make a difference. So these are not bad things, but it's really interesting because reading Psalm 90, verses 9 and 10, this is an interesting view of life. Okay, so the psalmist says, all our days pass away under your wrath. We finish our years with a moan. And in another translation, it's a sigh. We finish our years with a sigh. The length of our days is 70 years, or 80 if we have strength. Yet their span is but trouble and sorrow, for they quickly pass and we fly away. Is this about efficiency, or like getting stuff done, or like doing a whole bunch of stuff? Not really. This is a vision of life that's like, yeah, we just labor and toil and we just sigh. And life just passes us by. Something, but it's also obviously a valid vision of life, and it's something we don't talk about. So what am I talking about when I talk about violent communication and sort of this need to win that isn't in the psalm? Well, when I was another pastor that I was talking to, also very well-meaning, I was talking to him. This is maybe a little bit before my mom actually passed away. I was telling him about how bad she looked, and I was angry. And I was, kind of saying, oh, it's hard for me to believe in a kind God right now, at least emotionally, even if I can understand it in my head. And he let me talk for a bit, and then he looked at me and he said, God is bigger than your anger. And I thought, oh, okay, really kind of, okay, and then I went home. But I think he probably meant it in a good way, like, oh, maybe, something like God will overcome your sorrow or something. But I think it does speak to this need to win. Even for this, it was like, oh, well, God is bigger than your anger. So I think what happened was that he was presented with this really uncomfortable situation, which is that there's this angry person talking about her mom dying, and he didn't know what to do, probably. And then he's like, oh, how can I make this right? Oh, okay, God is bigger than your anger. But it wasn't the best response, I think, and it doesn't go with the psalm God is bigger than everything. The psalm is epic and huge. But there's no need, because of his bigness, to kind of win and be like, oh, well, it's going to be bigger than you. And I think that kind of communication is, like, I called it violent because it was kind of putting my feelings down in a way. Okay, but I know he didn't mean it, but that's kind of what ended up happening. I think that was his instinct because of these things in our culture. Okay, so the takeaways are that what I needed, or things that weren't happening in the community that I'm, the American society, are. So the takeaway is, one, the psalm does not deny death in the way that our culture or our society does. Death is actually a part of this epic vision of life, and it's there, and it's fine. Two, God is our dwelling place. So through life and death, we're in it together. Mourning is considered good, that vision of life and death, or it's just toil and sorrow. It's not that it's not supposed to happen. And then three, it's not necessary to have all the answers. So how many of you guys have read C.S. Lewis's A Grief Observed? I read it new. Okay. I read it back in a little after college, and he talks about grief. And I remember being disappointed because he's like, well, I don't really have the answers. You don't have to read it because this is the end. I'll just summarize it. Yeah, he says he doesn't have the answers. Okay. But I was actually really disappointed. I was reading and thinking, well, why don't you tell me the meaning of death? Why does this happen? What do we, tell me something. And he says he doesn't have the answers. But I think actually that is the right answer. I think the third thing that's really important is to have humility. So if you are going through this, then don't feel bad if you don't have sort of all the resources that you need. But the second thing is, if you have someone close to you who does go through it, the best thing you can offer is humility. So let me read you my favorite email that I got when my mom passed away from a friend of mine. She has no idea I'm doing this. So she wrote this. She said, I had heard that your mother had passed away, but I didn't know how to bring it up. I don't know how to deal with these things, so I was waiting for you to be ready to talk about it. I'm so sorry, Becky. So here, she was just basically kind of, I don't know. Like, she's not trying to say, oh, well, God's bigger than you, or whatever. Something like. She wasn't trying to come up with stuff. So, and that was really helpful. It was like a balm for me. And then she said, well, she can't. She's kind of saying, I don't know, but then she's gonna try, I don't know, but I'll try to imagine. So she says, that must have been hard for you to see your mom in pain like that. Well, at least she's in peace now. Is your sister doing okay? You should definitely enjoy yourself when you go on vacation, but I can imagine it being hard to process a parent's death. I don't know how I would deal with something like that. I'll be praying for you. Let me know if you want to get together once you get back to talk, or just do stupid stuff like shop and eat tons of food. I'm available at any time and for any purpose. It was great. She didn't try to reach for answers she didn't have, and then she just, she was, I don't know, yeah. It was great. So that's what you can do, I think. And I don't give answers for what American society should do about having sort of this warped view of death that is not consistent with the psalm. It's something I may look into in the future, but I think it's an important problem, I guess, that we face, and something to keep in mind. Yeah, and that's it. I hope you have a slightly different view of Psalm 90 than you had coming into this. Thank you.